My aim is to whet your interest, to think about some things that seem evident to me, but I've not been active in this industry. I'm just an observer. Most of my experience has been in the insurance industry, but I think that we can learn from each other, and that's my hope with this presentation. I want to start, though, by talking about something that shaped my thinking early in my career, and that's the 1905 Armstrong investigation, which involved a major scandal in the insurance industry. Scandal results when well-meaning executives put the interests of the organization ahead of the customers or beneficiaries that the organization is intended to serve. The challenge in the Armstrong investigation was that contracts had been devised which so favored the providers of the contracts that they were able to pay themselves handsome compensation. The classic case was the case of Henry Baldwin Hyde of the Equitable, who came to work in a horse and four with footmen who jumped down as it arrived at the office to roll out a red carpet. There were many other abuses in the industry, but compensation was the thing that brought public opinion to the fore. And we want to avoid any kind of whiff of scandal or ill repute that might cause a challenge to this industry. Its promise is too great, its mission too incredible, so we need to work together. We have a shared vision that both providers and residents have a shared vision to enable individuals to provide responsibly. That means without being dependent on government, without relying on the beneficence of others, to provide themselves for their own circumstances so that they provide responsibly for the inevitable transitions of aging without dependence on others, to allow for the time when they will grow frail and vulnerable with age, so that they can preserve their personal dignity and sense of fulfillment, and to allow for a seamless transition from an active life of achievement and satisfaction through the challenges of decline and loss until life finds its ultimate close with dignity, with remembrance, and with celebration of a life well lived. In looking at how the industry is doing, there are 5 areas that I want to touch on today. First is what I observe as stagnation. The CCRC industry's market share has been flat for many years. Then I get into ownership, since resident ownership may be the response that could help the industry to again begin to grow and to thrive. Also, the area of disclosures come up because it's very difficult for prospective residents to make fair comparisons, and fair comparisons are the basis for consumer trust. In looking at accounting, it appeared to me that revenues are not adequately matched to costs, and I want to talk about that. And finally, I think there are some regulatory lessons that the CCRC industry might learn from insurance. So we'll go through these one by one. First is this area of market stagnation. Today, the CCRC industry, or the independent living and congregate care part, is 2.5% of all senior living. That's a tiny sliver of the market and nowhere near what the industry's promise and potential would appear to be. If we look at how this comes about, here's the 2.5%. Assisted living, 1.9%. Skilled nursing, 6%. So we have more people living in skilled nursing facilities than we do in independent living CCRCs. Group quarters, which includes CCRC living, includes just 10.3% of all senior housing. Most seniors live in owner-occupied dwellings and about 17.5% in rental properties. And the evidence is that most older Americans want to continue living in the homes that they own. If we look at the trend line here over recent years, this goes from 1982 through 2009, ownership has been rapidly rising as a percentage of all dwelling options among people 75 years and over. That's the area of biggest growth. This is just an interesting chart. I mapped where AAHSA members are found. These are not necessarily just CCRCs. This is all AAHSA members. But the concentration is high, as you'd expect, in New York and Pennsylvania and Florida and California. If you look at the per capita coverage, that means the number of eligible seniors per AAHSA member. The concentration is strongest in Kansas, somewhat surprising. And Nevada is a neglected area. So this just shows how geographically dispersed is the industry's addressing of the need for this housing option. Communal living is rare. Many view it as a last resort and put it off as long as possible, and this shows that mighty clearly because here the largest group are those over age 85. So people put off moving into communal housing as long as they can. The result is that there's a heavy concentration of females because many women serve as caretakers for their husbands who then expire, leaving the women alone, and since they may by then be frail and vulnerable themselves, they require communal housing. The challenge is to persuade people that active living advantages of the independent living years are an attractive option for people who do not yet have major physical or mental problems. Some of the objections, you've heard all of these, we're not ready for that yet, which I interpret to mean we don't want to be institutionalized. Most people seem to view moving into a CCRC as an institutionalization. We don't want to give up ownership of our home. That's for old people. We're still vital and active. And this one I heard on a cruise ship recently when we met some people at a meal, and they were surprised to find we lived in a CCRC. And they said, we live in an active living community. They lived in, I think it was Leisure Village, one of those communities. CCRCs are assisted living. And then I described how we live and how we have our meals and everything. And the woman turned to her husband and repeated, that's assisted living. We've also heard people say, well, I've installed handrails and other precautions in my own home. Why do I need to move to a CCRC? People tend to view CCRCs as a last resort, and that's the perception that I think we want to try to until life finds its ultimate close with dignity, with remembrance, and with celebration of a life well lived. Today, provider ownership of communities is the norm. When these communities started, they had to be sponsored because they served the indigent and church workers who lived in genteel poverty and who lacked the wherewithal for ownership. But today's affluent aged can afford ownership. The indigent cannot. So if we can address the needs of the affluent, we can free resources to be used to help serve the needs of the indigent. There is one area where provider ownership facilitates, and that's the transition of apartment units released through vacancy. But resident ownership can improve the attractiveness of community living. It can encourage realtors to support the industry, can grow the industry to fulfill its mission and potential, can reduce financing challenges by bringing the industry into a more conventional capital context, and it can bring the industry into harmony with the trend toward home ownership into advanced age. Now, there are a number of ways that an ownership model might be achieved. I don't particularly care for the condominium model because the apartment is then owned in fee simple and can become tied up in an estate after the death of a resident. So I would favor a cooperative ownership model like that, which is common among many New York City apartments. And just to illustrate, how that might work, I've put together some thoughts here based on what I know from the New York experience. They required that 35% of existing residents accept the ownership model before a conversion plan can be effective. This means that providers who want to convert facilities to an ownership model would have to make it attractive for the existing residents to want to participate, and that prevents providers from simply trying to profit from the conversion. There can also be a vacancy conversion option, which means that people have a right to remain as tenants until the vacancy occurs through natural means. Incidentally, maybe I should have made clear that with cooperative ownership, the entire community is owned as a corporation, and the residents receive shares in that total corporation. The shares are generally apportioned relative to the relative valuations of the different apartment units. As an example, I'm suggesting a 9-person board of directors on which the provider would have a seat as long as the provider continues to own more than 15% of the shares. The provider could also select the managing agent, which could be itself, as long as the provider owns more than 25% of the shares. It's essential initially that the provider act as the managing agent to allow the residents and the board time to get familiar with the ownership model and all of the responsibilities that accompany ownership. The shares can only be held by residents or sold into treasury, and this allows for a smooth vacancy transition. That means that there'd be a valuation process, and when a resident dies, the heirs would simply be paid out of treasury for the shares, and those shares could then be resold to the incoming tenant at the valuation price. And the residents have a lifetime occupancy lease, just as CCRCs provide today. Incidentally, with the cooperative, I see no reason why a cooperative can't maintain nonprofit standing if it meets the requirements of Revenue Ruling 72-124, providing housing for the elderly, maintaining residents in occupancy if their needs or if their assets run out, and operating at the lowest feasible cost. Tom Mann recently wrote a piece saying that the CCRC was dead, meaning the concept, the name, the connotations of the name were detriment to acceptance of the CCRC living model. And this raises the question whether the name itself is a deterrent to acceptance of this form of living. Moving to a continuing care retirement community can signal to friends, relatives in the world that care is needed. You tell people you're moving, they say, what's the matter? That the need is continuing, and that the resident is retired and no longer an active member of society. This is not the case for seniors who downsize into an active living adult retirement community. There's much less pejorative connotation connected with that. Is there a more descriptive name for the service that the CCRC industry seeks to offer? What's in a name? How hard would it be to change the way the industry describes itself? And would that change how the industry thinks of itself and some of the cultural stagnation and how it conducts itself? Disclosure is a sensitive area right now in the industry, but this is a problem area for people who are contemplating moving to a community. The premise that guides me here is that the cost of aging is going to have to be met one way or another. It's either going to be met out of pocket by the consumer on a fee-for-service basis, which is the case if somebody just stays in the general community and lives in the home that they've always lived in, or it can be met by prepayment for an extensive care contract or for comparable long-term care coverage, or by reliance on government, or by some combination of those. There are other possibilities that we don't even want to contemplate, but basically the cost is the cost, and the question is whether the provision is made for people to provide for that cost responsibly or not. Many people choose CCRC living as a responsible way to provide for their own anticipated costs of aging. Consumers tend to base their choice of a CCRC on location, quality of facility, reputation, size of apartments, cost relative to their budget, and perceptions concerning non-profit organizations' commitment to service. So these questions of how these costs of aging are to be met don't generally enter into their thinking. They assume that that's part of the deal. Consumers assume that all CCRCs are contractually similar. The differences between Type A and Type C contracts and all various in between are readily quantifiable. So it's surprising that these are choices that are just at the community level and not something that individuals are able to choose depending on what kind of financial and other commitments they want to make. Likewise, the differences among entrance fee refund arrangements are readily quantifiable. Both sets of differences can be standardized and disclosed, or greater contract flexibility can be made available through a central industry facility. And I'm going to get into some of the technical details of that in a minute. I want to forewarn you because I would rather just say we'd set up a central facility and it would provide this and take this risk off the shoulders of the providers. But I think you need some of the technicalities to grasp the details of exactly what it is that I'm suggesting here. I believe that AAHSA can play a facilitating role to support providers by developing such a central long-term care refund insurance capability. The difference between a Type A and a Type C contract is full coverage long-term care insurance. First, full coverage long-term care is not available on the insured market. So people either get it from the CCRC or they have to self-insure it. The life care part of a CCRC contract can have a lower net claims cost than can an insured long-term care product, because the provider can manage the care to provide quality at the lowest possible cost. This managerial oversight is not now available to long-term care insurers who are third-party payers. And life care coverage can have a lower sales and marketing component than does open market long-term care insurance. Typically, 40% of long-term care insurance goes for expenses, and roughly 30% of that is going into the sales and marketing area, and the sales and marketing costs of the CCRC community are already being met by the existing structure. So that component of the cost would not be needed, and the coverage can be provided much more efficiently. Similar thinking applies to entrance fee refund provisions. These differences are difficult for prospective residents to value or compare. For example, in my community, they offer a 90% refund contract, but the cost is double the entrance fee relative to what it would be otherwise. Since the fee is double, the 10%, 90% means you lose 10%. Well, that 10% becomes 20% of the lower fee paid if you have a no refund contract. And so anybody can see that that's not actuarially computed, and that you're better off to keep that money and invest it yourself. But this means that people don't have the added protection of the refund provision. The refund provision is analogous to a single premium life insurance benefit with a full non-forfeiture value. Now, looking at this central role, here's what I'm thinking of. The central facility could develop long-term care rates which would be conservatively computed. That would mean they'd be worst case, they'd cover the worst case potential experience, similar to the way charitable gift annuity rates are developed by the American Council on Gift Annuities. We could also develop an AAHSA rating manual to allow facilities to give credits to those residents who have pre-purchased open market long-term care insurance. So it could make a smooth continuum of protection with what people have purchased before and what they are able to get from the facility. And AAHSA, or the central facility, could help to systematize entrance requirements, risk selection, what medical evidence is needed before somebody enters the community, and how do rates need to be adjusted to allow anybody who presents themselves, no matter what their condition, to have an equitably determined cost of entrance. That's a specific skill that can be made available centrally, and I give an example of a company that specializes in turnkey operation for long-term care, but there may be others as well. Similarly, the refund provision could be likewise conservatively calculated. Now, the rates for the long-term care and the rates for the refund would be conservative, and then if a particular facility is able to achieve a better result than what the pricing margins would suggest, they can earn experience refunds so that money can be returned to the community, to the provider, to use for other purposes. This would free providers of the financial risks of long-term care and the entrance fee provisions, allowing them to focus on what they do best, resident support and care. This shows how the cost of long-term care accelerates with advancing age. I've done this by taking the federal employees' long-term care program rates which I thought were reasonably indicative of very low margin group rates. And I've marked up, they have a plan that covers roughly 50% of the cost, so I've marked that up to try to cover the full cost at a facility like the facility that I live in. So you can see that the cost accelerates dramatically, and by age 100, virtually everyone is in a skilled nursing facility and has the full cost of total care. If you look at it the way you might look at it on an entrance fee basis, or comparable to the charitable gift annuity model where you prepay the full cost of the long-term care, this is what the present value of the long-term care might look like. I'm not really sure why this dip occurs. It was in the federal rate, so I left it there just to stay true to the data that I was working with. This is really illustrative. It suggests that for people in their late 80s and early 90s, the cost maxes out here at about $260,000. It's much lower for people who come in at the younger ages, and that's something that the industry could use to its advantage. Now we move on to looking at the gap accounting, and the matching principle is central to accounting integrity, and the example is that of a magazine subscription where you pay $100 for a 5-year subscription. If the magazine company spent all the $100 in the first year and left nothing to provide the magazine for the remaining 4 years, we would view that as irresponsible. So they set up a liability, and they release the money from that liability ratably over the life of the magazine subscription. We have a similar thing with the entrance fee accounting. But accounting rules today are legislated. They're not principles based. And the FASB rules have to be followed if you're going to have gap certification, even when the results are contrary to fundamental accounting principles. FASB treats the refundable portion of the entrance fee as a liability. So it gives it a higher precedence than it does other contract benefits, such as the deferred long-term care costs. This is something that I'm not sure how this came to be, but if you consider that the refund is simply a contract benefit like any other, they ought to all be treated the same. Moreover, FASB requires that the non-refundable entrance fee be amortized into income over the remaining life expectancy of the resident. But approximately half the residents outlive their life expectancy. So the entrance fee has been fully taken into account over the life expectancy, but half are outliving it. So the revenue recognition has been accelerated, and this is inconsistent with the matching principle. Because of this very conservative treatment of the contractual refund benefit, the gap results are highly sensitive. This shows the results with a 75% refund provision. This gray line is the way costs are actually incurred. This is for an 80-year-old individual over the lifetime of a cohort of 80-year-olds. Obviously, as these people die, they're replaced, and I haven't tried to loop around to bring it up to the community level. FASB front ends the refund, the income, as you can see here, with the result that the income appears higher in the early years, but then is lower than the cost. There's a shortfall in the later years that has to be made up somehow. And what I've done here is to show how actuaries might look at the cost, but not all actuaries would agree on that. So that's just to provide an illustration. Here we see what happens with a sharply declining balance refund provision. And the cost here, that the FASB cost, has dropped down because I've recomputed actuarially the monthly fee to take into account the fact that the forfeitures of the entrance fee in these later years will be available to help reduce the cost. But that's not how providers tend to do their pricing. They tend to do it on a market basis. And since the market has many contracts with a refund provision, they tend to do their pricing comparable to communities that provide a full refund even when they have a declining balance refund. So the result is that they're charging something like the cost for the 75% refund contract, for example, even though their true costs are lower. And this provides unexpected gains, which can create temptations for providers. They may feel that they've been unexpectedly successful or whatever. My sense is that this effect is not well understood. What I've done here is to add to the preceding chart the way the contract would allow the pricing. And the refund costs accelerate rapidly. This is the revenues from the entrance fee, no, the refund. So initially people can get their money back, and then gradually it goes in. So this is the contract income, the cash flow income, and how that might come in. There are a number of consequences from this, and these have been known for many years. The Winklevoss-Powell book pointed this out. It was in the Morrison book. It's been known for 25 years and virtually ignored by the industry and by FASB. Nonprofit boards, eager to hold cost increases to a minimum, may not seek sufficient increases in the early years of a facility, and this leads to large make-up increases in the later years, which can create hardship for the residents. Management may be, after seeing those unexpected increases, may be misled to believe that more extensive contracts are too risky, and this drives the industry toward the fee-for-service model, which shifts financial risk onto the residents and is contrary to the fundamental mission of the industry. The result also favors the initial move-in generation of residents who do not pay their full share, with the difference left to be made up inequitably by later generations of residents. And finally, accreditation agencies like CARF base their ratios on GAAP accounting, and their results may be skewed unless the evaluators are able to recognize fully the limitations of the GAAP accounting model. The insurance industry has statutory accounting, which is a more reasonable basis for, which if applied to CCRCs would be a more reasonable basis for protecting the interests of the residents that these communities nominally serve. The industry could work with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners to devise some kind of standards. And I should say a word about what the National Association of Insurance Commissioners is. This organization was formed in 1871, before there was the federal government was the overweening force that it is today, to allow the regulators in the various states to cooperate together to regulate the multi-state activities of the large insurance companies. And the NAIC meets 3 times a year. They adopt model laws and regulations which are then enacted into law verbatim in all 50 states and other jurisdictions such as the Virgin Islands and Guam and the Marshall Islands. So there's a uniformity of regulation that results from this model that is not present for the CCRC industry. But I'll come back to that in a minute. Additionally, the CCRC industry could convene a group of financial officers to consider what the financial management needs of the industry are, and this is likely to be different from the period earnings emphasis of manufacturing business. So the thinking of a CCRC industry group would be different from that of FASB. Of course, FASB could legislate replacement CCRC gap standards. That seems unlikely. This industry is a minor part of the responsibilities which FASB is trying to deal with. But the CCRC industry has a higher responsibility toward its mission to provide soundly for resident security than it has toward conformance with FASB edicts. The industry might well take the lead in defining appropriate CCRC accounting. What lessons might the industry learn from insurance regulation? Well, first, regulation can foster industry growth and prosperity. Regulators are the industry's friend, not its adversary. CCRC regulation now varies widely from state to state. Life insurance regulation is mostly uniform from state to state due to the National Association of Insurance Commissioners model laws and regulations. Insurance policies have a guarantee. The policyholders are protected from loss if an insurance company fails, just as depositors in a bank are protected by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. I think that the insurance model, which works at the state level on a post-assessment, meaning that there's no assessment if there's no failure, that model would be more appropriate for the CCRC industry. But those laws could be adapted to protect CCRC residents from loss in the event of failure, and the commitment that that guarantee was there could help to promote CCRC living as an option for seniors. Actuaries have been the guardians of individual equity in insurance. There's no comparable standard for CCRC pricing. It seems to be whatever the market will bear. Insurance contracts are subject to standards, and CCRC contracts vary widely. I was shocked when I was asked to sign a contract to move into the community where I live that required me to warrant the assets that my brokerage firm said that I had. Warrant meant that if the brokerage firm had misled me as Bernie Madoff misled his investors, I would be required to make up that difference. Insurance contracts are only allowed to be based on representations, and applicants for insurance are only required to make representations to the best of their knowledge and belief. Why would the CCRC industry require people to warrant something that's beyond their best knowledge and belief? I have difficulty with that. Moreover, insurance contracts have other standardization and safeguards that are simply not present in CCRC contracts. And finally, there are insurance involves solvency protections in the form of interventions that are stronger than those for CCRCs. If an insurer is troubled, it's possible for the industry to come together to try to resolve the trouble and to avert the insolvency. And that is not the case with the CCRC industry, that may even be precluded by antitrust considerations from cooperating in this way. There's an exemption that allows insurers to act jointly for the best interests of the policyholders. Here's an example of an obvious inequity that would not occur in the insurance industry. The industry norm is for residents who, and I put it in greater detail so that it can be clear. The industry norm is for residents who voluntarily change apartments to pay the current market entrance fee for the new unit, but they're only credited with what they paid originally for the unit they're giving up. The provider can then remarket the unit the resident gives up at the current market. So the provider gets an unearned gain equal to the difference between the current market the provider is able to sell that unit for and the out-of-date credit granted the relinquishing resident. The relinquishing resident, the person who's transferring, who may be transferring because of health or whatever, is in effect required to subsidize the provider to the extent of the unearned gain. Moreover, even though the moving resident pays full market rate, any declining refund provisions are not restarted. That's outrageous. This is analogous to changes of plan in life insurance and annuities, for which great care is given to preserve equity, and this is something that actuaries spend considerable effort on. The obvious unfairness of the CCRC transfer rules inhibit internal unit transfers, reducing turnover and likely reducing the financial efficiency of the community as a whole. Somebody who was married when they moved in and wanted a large unit has no incentive to downsize into a smaller unit. If they did, that larger unit would be freed up and the provider would be able to resell it at current market. By having these strange transfer rules, those internal movements are stalled, and the overall income, even though it appears that they're getting this unearned gain, they actually don't get it because residents naturally resist it, and the community as a whole suffers financially. Inequities like this are not only potentially counterproductive financially, but they're also a proper object for regulatory interest. And I talked about the scandal that accompanied the Armstrong investigation. You can imagine what would happen if an investigating body were to discover this kind of inequity prevalent within the industry. Well, it would not be pretty. What can AAHSA do? Well, AAHSA is very effective at producing study materials that can serve as guides for the industry in allowing providers to recognize best practices and to move forward constructively. They have a long history. They participated in the 1984 Winklevoss-Powell study. So they could study equity ownership options and how they might impact nonprofit status and other aspects of CCRC operation. They could consider this central facility to take these risk elements away from the providers who are clearly uncomfortable with them, and to make those centralized and specialized hands centrally for both long-term care and the entrance fees. They could study these interests, these questions of equity relating to internal transfers and the intergenerational finances of the facilities. And AAHSA could become familiar with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners and get a sense of how that might allow it to meet some of the regulatory challenges that the industry faces. I've omitted an awful lot of material. When I first was working on it, I was tempted to include a lot of things. But there's no talk here about leadership, education, qualification, and training. It seems evident to me that the leadership is not as financially astute as might be desirable, since it's been over 25 years since the Winklevoss and studies were released, and the industry has not responded to them. Technology, I think there's an awful lot that could be done in using technology to deliver services. Spirituality and aging is an area that there's a core interest of many of the pastoral people who are involved in the industry, and yet this is an area, the sacredness of end-of-life transitions is something that we're just now really coming to grips with and beginning to understand. The challenge of the nonprofit justification, the question whether today's social accountability is really responsive to the justification for nonprofit standing. There's a question of ethnic diversity, affordability, and just what the mission is. Is the mission to merely serve the affluent, or is it broader? The provider organizations tend to be hierarchical. More modern organizations are evolving, and there may be different forms of organization that could better meet the needs of the industry. There are practicalities in the resident-provider partnership. And finally, I've not addressed the questions of the acceleration of executive compensation, which have occurred for some providers who have taken advantage of the safe harbor provisions connected with the Internal Revenue Code 4958 to move executive compensation to what seem like high levels. These are interesting topics, but they're beyond today's non-forfeiture value. Now, looking at this central role, here's what I'm thinking of. The central facility could develop long-term care rates which would be conservatively computed. That would mean they'd be worst case, they'd cover the worst case potential experience, similar to the way charitable gift annuity rates are developed by the American Council on Gift Annuities. We could also develop an AAHSA rating manual to allow facilities to give credits to those residents who have pre-purchased open market long-term care insurance. So it could make a smooth continuum of protection with what people have purchased. But now, I was asked to summarize this because I went over this with a friend, and they felt I was covering too much material, and they said, what is it exactly that you really want out of this? So I think my answer is what I call renewal, and it's what I want to leave you with. For substance, I would like to see this central contract specialized risk facility with the capability to take those challenges constructively away from providers and let the providers concentrate on what they do well. I'd also like to see some thinking done to take a more positive approach to resident ownership. There's a comparison table that AAHSA puts out that makes ownership sound like a burden that any well-thinking, right-thinking senior would want to avoid. It talks about it suggests that ownership might end the nonprofit standing. I'm not convinced that that's true, but that's suggested. It suggests that it has all the burdens of real estate ownership and the etc. One is particularly disingenuous. It says facility may share in appreciation. Well, if the facility owns it, is the current model, the current landlord-tenant model, well, yeah. But anyway, so those are two elements of substance I'd like to see addressed. In addition, I'd like to see, and I think this ties in with that, with the substance, but I'd like to see the perception change, that people are aging, they don't have to be institutionalized. like to see the people who work with them be empowering and not detached. And I'd like the industry to have an understanding that it can be supportive, and that being supportive is more than just providing care. And lastly, perhaps we could have a more positive name and concept than continuing care retreat. What can AAHSA do? Well, AAHSA is very effective in your living, better living communities for tomorrow's opportunities.